let's talk about lighting. If you've ever seen filming done with huge amounts of super bright lights, you'd be forgiven for concluding that you need very bright lights in order to get a good, clear, bright image. But that's not actually what's going on. So let's talk about why you need all these lights and what the lighting is doing for you. So with a modern camera, modern digital camera, you actually don't need that much light in the room to get a clear, bright image. We've talked about camera settings, and we're going to look at the end of this section, some combinations of camera settings and lighting, and you'll see you can get a nice bright image with quite low lighting in the room. But lighting is doing something different. You need a minimal amount of light to be able to capture colors and good contrast. But the lighting is actually important for doing a couple of different things. And it's really the balance of lighting, the configuration of lighting in your studio, in your room, that's the most important thing. And here's why. The lighting has to eliminate shadows and avoid glare and be consistent and reproducible. So it's not that you need a single super bright light. It's not that you're flooding the scene with super bright light and the rest doesn't matter. It's actually very important that you're lighting different sides of your subject to avoid shadows and avoid glare. And that's harder than you might think. And it almost always involves a combination of lights. So in the room that I'm filming now, I have one main light, which is sometimes called a key light. That's the light that's above me, mounted to the ceiling beam, and would traditionally be pointed straight at me, or it's bouncing off. That's got a diffuser in front of it. This is what's called a soft box. It sort of pops out, the camera goes inside it, and it helps diffuse the light to spread it out and make it softer, so doesn't generate dramatic glare in specific places. I've got a little bit of light coming off the ceiling, but if that light on the ceiling is turned too high, you'll see a big glare coming off my head or my nose, etc. Then we've got a couple of side lights. Sometimes they're called fill lights, and those are helping to get rid of shadows that might be cast on the side of my face or cast by different appendages. And then sometimes there's what's called a hair light or a backlight that's sort of coming up behind me. In my case, it's coming from the side, that just sort of separates the subject from the background. And all of these different lights, you would play around with them until you get the right balance. If you've got multiple subjects, it's even trickier. You want to get them, it's not that you want to throw out a huge quantity of light, although frequently the brighter the better, within reason, but it's the balance of the lighting that reduces the shadows and the glare. For filming board gaming, if you're doing a review and you're just talking to a camera, you probably don't care what the room looks like. But if you're filming a long 2-hour, sometimes I do 6 or 7 hour sessions, the auxiliary goal is to have natural lighting in the room that's comfortable to play under. So those are the kinds of things you're thinking about. And then actually the overall brightness of the room is actually not that important. And anywhere within a fairly large range is going to get you a good image. You just have to adjust your camera and the ISO setting of the camera to balance the brightness of the room. The brighter the lights are in the room, the lower you can turn your ISO setting down, which eliminates reduces the noise that the sensor picks up if you have to turn the ISO setting off, or if you have to turn it up to compensate for a dark room. So we'll look at some of those settings and how they interact and how the light in the room interacts with the settings of the camera. But just remember, it's not about creating a super bright room. It's about getting the room bright enough and then getting the balance of lighting right. And I guess maybe another thing to mention is to talk about natural light from outdoors. Now, if you're filming a movie, maybe you want to capture that perfect sunrise light that makes everything look fantastic. But if you're filming and you're filming at different hours of the day, natural light from outside is not so great. It's hard to compete with, so if it's coming in from one side, it's going to be hard to light the person's other side with an artificial light that makes it look balanced. And it's hard to get the color temperature of the outside light, and if you're filming in different times of the day, that's hard to be consistent. So what I do is I black out the windows in this room and only light by artificial light. That gives me complete control over everything, and that's, I guess, what I would recommend. Another issue to consider with lights, nowadays almost everything will be an LED light as of 2022. They have lots of advantages in terms of using less electricity, but they also generate less heat, which is good. If you're in a closed small room, you're generating quite a bit of heat from all the equipment and the lights, so you want to minimize the heat generation. You'll also have a choice of temperature. So this is a Neewer 660. It's about $100. I use these as my two side lights. There's one facing me from this direction, one facing me from this direction. You can see it mounts on a standard light stand that goes in there, and you can mount these to the wall, whatever. And it's got a minimal diffuser, although it's meant to go inside the softbox to diffuse it even more. That's quite important. You want to diffuse the light as much as possible. It creates a softer, more general amount of light. But you can see on this light that it's actually got LEDs of two temperatures, a warm set and a cool set. And you'll be familiar with this from your home lighting. You can buy bulbs that are cool white or soft white. And I talked about before that it's not all that important what temperature your lights are, because you can compensate that with white balance settings to make whatever the skin tone looks like under a cool light look however you want. You just have to spend more time adjusting the white balance of your camera. But for me, I prefer playing in a soft yellowish light. So that's something to consider if you're looking for lights. These, as I say, you can adjust the temperature completely. But the overhead light I have, which is a Godox VL150, I believe, it isn't adjustable by temperature. So you'd want to pay attention a little bit to what you're buying there. You wouldn't want to buy one light that's only soft warm and one light that can only do cool white. The mesh of those two colors might be hard to balance out. I think the main light I have, the key light I have, this big powerful VL or Godox 150, is about $300. And I think if I were to do it again, I wouldn't buy that big main light. I'd probably use one or two of these. They just take up less space. They're easier to mount against a wall. This one in particular can be powered by battery if you ever wanted to move around, or plug in. One of the nice things about that overhead light is it's got a little remote control that can control how bright it is. If you do buy a big light like this 150, one of the things you should be thinking about is making sure it's quiet. These things have fans on them to dissipate heat. You want to make sure you get one that is whisper quiet, especially if it's going to be mounted above, which is right next to your microphone. So that's a quick discussion of the lighting hardware you might use. I've talked before about how I've got my front lights all mounted to cabinet or the wall or the beam, get them off the floor. They tend to be top heavy, so if you did want to mount them on the floor, you'd have to take up quite a bit of floor space with these floor stands. And always look to use a softbox or something to diffuse them. If you're working in a small room, that front light may be hard. You might be tempted to get this big umbrella softbox. They've got some umbrella softboxes that are like 3 foot long and 3 foot diameter, and they actually produce a beautifully soft light, and they can light a whole large area without focusing light in one pinpoint area, which is what you want. But you may not have room for them in your room. You have to look at that. So that's why I tend to use these soft boxes, which are quite shallow. They're not as good as an umbrella soft light, which can diffuse to a wider area, but they're good enough, they're better, and they work in a small space. Let's take a look now at some interactions of lights, hardware, and camera settings. Now we're going to look at some different lighting setups and see how that affects the look of the scene. So I've got now my normal lighting setup. It's a little brighter. The camera is adjusted to be a little brighter than normal, and I'm going to explain that now because this is a key important thing to understand about lighting. You might think, okay, if I turn most of the lights off, it'll look a lot darker. But it's not quite as simple as that. What you have to remember is the brightness you're seeing in the video is a combination of the actual light in the room and then the settings on the camera for aperture and for ISO, which is the brightness gain of the camera. So if I turn the lights off but raise the gain of the camera, the ISO up, it should look about the same brightness. So what does turning the lights on and off actually do? Well, it actually does have a substantial effect, but you shouldn't think of it in terms of overall brightness of the scene. The lighting is affecting things like shadows, glare, and highlights, and it's affecting the natural light in the scene to actually play a board game if you're playing it. And the brighter the lights, the lower the ISO gain has to be, which results in a cleaner image with less noise. Okay, so here's what I've done. Normally I advocate all manual settings on your camera, but for this video, I've turned the ISO to auto. So the camera itself is going to increase the gain, brightness, or decrease it based on the light it perceives in the room. So that as I change what lights are on, it should adjust the image you see so that it's approximately the same brightness. But remember, that's going to introduce a lot more noise when it's dark, and you'll still be able to see the effect of things like shadows and glare, etc. Okay, so here's our baseline image, all my lights on. Let's go over what lights are on, actually. We've got 2 side lights coming in. You might call those fill lights. We've got a main key light above and bouncing off towards me. And then we've got some background lights off at the side of the room. We've got an overhead light on the ceiling, and we've got a little blue LED light in the bookshelf behind me. All right, so let's try messing with some combinations of those. Okay, I've turned the overhead light off. Probably doesn't look that much different to you. the board actually, to me, looking is quite a bit darker. So in terms of enjoyability of being able to play, the room feels quite dark. The board especially looks dark. So there's one example. Now we're going to turn the ceiling light to maximum, and you'll see what effect it has. Okay, ceiling light is now maximum. You can probably see the top of my head is too bright. I can see that the camera is telling me the highlights are blown out, so it's much too bright. It actually looks brighter. So if we were manually adjusting the ISO, we would probably turn it down. It's just that the camera's AI is not smart enough to know that the scene as a whole is too bright. Let's turn the ceiling light back to normal, and let's mess with the background lights. Okay, we're back to normal lighting. Just wanted to get our baseline set again. Now I'm going to turn off the background lights, the lights at the far end of the room that aren't doing that much. Okay, here we go. I've turned off the lights at the far end of the room that sort of shine towards me on this side. And does it look that much different to you? It may not. The room feels very dark now, though. So those are sort of general lights. They're just filling the entire room with the sort of diffuse light. It may not have that much effect on you, but it has an effect on the enjoyability of playing in this room. All right, let's try the background, the LED light. Let's turn that off, see how that looks. Okay, the LED light behind me is now off. Does that make much of a difference? It's sort of breaking the rule of YouTube. You're sort of required to have some background colored LED behind you. But other than that, it doesn't look that much different to me. Let's try messing with the two main fill lights on my left and my right. Okay, so the two main fill lights, one from the left, one from the right, are now off. The overall scene may look about the same, but you should start to see some shadows on me as I move around, and the room feels very dark. I've got the side lights off as well. How unpleasant is this with just a main front-facing light? Let's try turning one of the side lights on and off in turn. All right, here we go. The left side light is on. The left fill light, I guess you'd call it. The main light is on, but the right-hand light over here is not on. Let's try reversing that. Okay, now the right fill light is on and the main key light is on, but the left light over here is not on. When it's one person in the center, some of these views of lighting may not make too much a difference. When you've got two people on either side, it really can make a difference in terms of lighting one of the people and not the other. All right, let's try turning the main front light off and just have the... Well, let's try turning the main front light and the side lights off. Let's see what we get. Okay, I'm sitting here in a very dark room. The only light that's on is the overhead light. It looks dark. It looks weird. There's shadows everywhere. Just for fun, shall we try turning off the overhead light and let's just have the light of the monitor shining on me? Okay, so I'm sitting here basically mostly in the dark. Just the light of the monitor shining on me, but you can see this camera has pretty good low light performance, and it's ramped the gain all the way up to give you a reasonably bright image, but you see all the colors are washed out. It just looks terrible. There aren't that many shadows now because there's not that much light. All right, let's come back. Let's try the front light on higher than normal. Okay, now I've only got the main front key light on. The left and right fill lights are not on, but I've got that camera turned up to 90%, whereas normally I run it at 55. So there might be a bit of a glare on the front of my face. Let's go back to our normal baseline image. Okay, here we are back at baseline. All the lights are on. The main light is on at half power. The two left and right key light fill lights are on. The back side lights are on. Only the LED, blue LED behind me is not on, and the ceiling is on low. Now I thought we'd try changing the color temperature of the two fill lights. The left and the right light are LED. They're Neewer 600, 660s, and they can have their temperature adjusted. So now it's a little bit warm, but let's try making it full cool. Okay, I've changed the temperature of the two side lights, the two fill lights, from mostly warm to full cool. And you can see there's an analogy with the color temperature of the lights in the same way there is with the ISO gain and the quantity of light, in that I've changed the temperature of the lights, so we should see a sort of a bluer look for me. But you could adjust that by adjusting the white balance to give you the same exact look. In fact, if we turned it on auto white balance now, it would balance out that situation depending on the light. So you have to remember that your lights do not operate in isolation. They operate in conjunction with the camera settings, and it's a balancing act to get the look you want. And here we are back to normal. Again, maybe a little brighter than it would be if I was manually adjusting, but we've got the automatic ISO gain setting on just to help us do all these comparisons. For your situation and your room and the look you want, you'll have to experiment. Remember, what you're going for is you're trying to eliminate shadows, minimize glare at the high points. For example, the books with the white spines sometimes highlight and are too bright. Sometimes your head is too bright. So you're trying to minimize glare. You're trying to get the room a brightness that's comfortable to be in and work in and play in. So you're balancing all of those things, getting the look you want. And when you get the look you want, you write it down, you record it, so that you can reproduce it and have a consistently pleasing look.